My name is Alan Grabo. My background's in psychology, and I've been doing test prep for, and English tutoring for about 15 years. Um, my colleague Harriet, who has been doing this for quite some time, she's been working in the same location in Potomac for over 30 years. And we focus primarily on individual one-on-one intensive test prep. So we try to teach efficient reading strategies, and we start as early as freshman year all the way through into college. So yeah, I just wanted to introduce that. And next slide, please. All right. So I wanted to start by just giving the sort of take home big picture overview of what's going on with the SAT at the moment. It's kind of been in the news fairly frequently lately. There was the test optional, there's the new digital, but I think the easiest way to sum it up is that it has gone through changes like this before. It probably will continue to do so, but it is still the most commonly used and most important part for for millions of college applications. So the test optional, of course, for some specific cases like California, it does make a small difference, but at the end of the day, studying for the SAT is going to be your best shot at scholarships, at increasing your acceptance rate. And to be honest, the trend has been toward making the skills that you need more closely aligned with actually useful skills that you're going to use in your everyday sort of classwork. So, you know, at the very least, or I should say, for the best, we're getting closer to really trying to test that skill rather than just quirks of the SAT or the ACT or the format of the test, which I think is a really positive thing. So, okay. That said, just going to skip through. Oh no, first we're going to start just with if you're really unfamiliar with how the SAT works nowadays, this is the overall format of the paper and pencil test right now. So you've got 4 sections, but you can broadly split it up into 3. So we're going to start with the reading section. That's going to be 5 passages. They're more or less in the same order, but each of them is between 600 and 800 words long, and then that's followed by 10 to 11 questions. And the subject matter of the different passages is always going to be the same. So you'll have a US or a literature, history, 2 sciences, and a paired passage. So it's fairly long and definitely one of the major changes that's going to happen with the digital. But for now, we're sticking with pen and paper. Okay, so reading, then you've got writing and language, which is also 4 passages long, also 11 questions, and got it, thank you. Okay, right, so the math section then is split up into 2. This one didn't update, one with the calculator and one without. So overall, this is the layout. That's good cutting off. Oh, so I kind of wanted to give as much as I can a picture of how the SAT scores are going, how many students are taking the SAT versus the ACT in the different states and things like that. So it looks like it cut off there at the bottom, but the bluer states are higher average SAT scores. The red are lower. We are Maryland fairly on the high end of average. And I'm going to break it down by year in a bit here. So this is, again, just a quick overview. 1972. Frustrating. Okay. Yeah, this is slightly okay. So this is the scores as they've changed over time. Don't know why it's cutting off before the 2000s, but what happens with this trend is that you've got the red line that is the verbal, and the math is the green, they more or less go along, correlate with one another. There's a spike in 2016 that has to do with the redesign of the test. But this is the particularly relevant thing to Maryland. So the red states here are not taking the SAT, but are instead favoring the ACT. And that trend has been changing a lot in the last 10 years. So traditionally, the SAT was an East Coast kind of thing, and the ACT was started kind of as competition, mostly in the Midwest, but there are a bunch of factors that keep changing lately due to the digital stuff. But okay, next slide, please. This is so frustrating. Okay. I'm gonna send you a newer version. Giuseppe, should I send you the updated? No, I'm just gonna have to stick with this. No problem. All right, so here's an overview of the SAT from 1901 on. So the College Board started out just using it as an essay exam. In 1926, they actually started administering it to a few thousand students. That's what that Latin should be saying. And in 93, 94, there were a bunch of updates that substantially changed it. So 93, 94, they removed the antonyms, which synonyms. They added many more questions on the reading passages. So from 30 to about 50%. And they really made an effort to choose reading passages that more closely resembled college level reading materials. So that has been the trend overall. If you look at the 1901 version, obviously it is very arcane. The skills that you needed to succeed on it were not really related to critical reading or logical expression or using evidence to support your claims. And that has been the overall sort of goal with these redesigns through the decades. So if we go on to the next slide, yeah. In 2005, they tried a brief experiment with the new SAT. So they added an extra essay section, changed the scoring rubric from 1,600 to 2,400 points. And they removed things like analogies and basically just really tried to mix it up where the ACT was staying the same. In 2012, they introduced then the option to report only the scores that you wanted to report to your college admissions. Score choice versus super scoring are the two options that have been sort of, they are intended to help make sure that the scores that people are sending into colleges are representative of, well, I should say, are not discriminating in terms of the access to things like tutoring, like socioeconomic, basically all kinds of concerns that have been expressed through the last 100 years or so. The goal has always been to make it as accurate and straightforward a test of college level skills as it can be. So they experimented with a few of these other changes here, and then in 2016 they decided to revert back. So they reintroduced these evidence-based questions, made the essay optional again, and really notably they removed the vocabulary. So most of us, if you remember taking the SAT, there was a lot of rote vocab memorization, and that's really just not the case anymore. The only test that still has a significant amount of vocab is the SSAT, but for both the ACT and SAT, we're just the goal is to use vocabulary and to have a full understanding of how and when to use it, rather than just a list of very fancy words. So that's cool. They also reduced the answer choices down from 5 to 4. which I think is a pretty good move, and also got rid of the wrong answer penalty, making it bringing it in line with the ACT. So again, it kind of removing that very strategic, only test-centered sort of decisions that you'd have to make. And again, I like that trajectory. All right, so 2021. So they had been going back and forth between making the essay optional, whether or not they would even administer it. So they've finally gotten rid of both the essay and the subject tests, which I think is also a good move. And next year, as you may have heard, is coming the digital SAT. So you've got a little overview there of the rollout. So as always, when they make changes to the SAT, they start it first with the PSAT. So this past October, we had both pen and paper PSAT and pen and paper SAT. So next year, we will be looking at the first digital PSAT, but the SAT will still be pen and paper, and March 2024 will be fully digital. So we can talk again at the end, as much as you guys are interested in finding out about how those changes are happening. We do have like much more information now about the exact changes, including things like full practice test, which is great. You guys are listening. Okay, yeah, so this is a really complete overview here of the new versus current SAT and ACT. The big picture here is that digital is going to be an hour, almost an hour shorter. So it's going from 3 hours, which it is currently, to 2 hours, 14 minutes. So nice in the sense that it's not just testing sort of the ability to maintain focus. And I mean, yeah, again, it's controversial. We don't know exactly how it's all going to play out in some ways, but I do like a lot of the decisions that they're making. And the other big change now is that currently the pen and paper SAT is split up into, verbal and math sections, and then within there you have two separate stages, basically, right? So the verbal is reading and writing, and the math is math with a calculator, math without a calculator. What they're going to do with this adaptive system is that you have two identical stages, which are both the same length, same number of questions, and rather than splitting it between reading and writing, you mix them up and you do the exact same thing twice, but the better you do on that first stage, the more difficult questions you get presented on stage 2. So it's adaptive to the level of the student taking it, which is a very good aim for various reasons that we can talk about later. But again, I think it's most people were a bit concerned at first because we heard that, for example, the passages were much shorter. There was only one question about each reading passage. There was a lot of concern initially, but as we found out more and more, I think the consensus is that it seems to be going in a pretty good direction. So hopefully that's reassuring for some of you guys. Let's see, is there anything else? Same score, etc. So thank you. No, we're good to go. So okay. Again, if we want to talk more in detail about that at the end, I'm happy to, but let's move on to an overview of the ACT. So I mentioned, and I'm sure many of you are aware that it was designed specifically to be a competitor to the SAT. So overall, it is less popular nationwide, in Maryland in particular. It is not very popular. Last year, according to the most recent stats, only 8% of students in Maryland chose to take the ACT, but it is equally valid, equally accepted by every admissions departments. So there is no test that's preferred by specific schools or certain guidance counselors or anything like that. They directly translate one to another. But the main difference in our experience is it really just comes down to time. So you just have more time per question on the SAT, and for most students, that tends to make the difference. So this is 70% or more end up favoring the SAT, but again, it is absolutely worth taking the time to make sure. So you can take practice tests. I will explain some of the very short assessments that we had that just ask about your skills and your preferences, and we can help make sure that they choose the right test for them. Next slide, please. Okay, so the format of the ACT, similar. The obvious difference here is that the science section at the end is separate on the ACT. So similarly, you've got 5 long passages: world lit, history, science, social. So that's more or less identical. They've been moving in the same direction for like the last 20 years or so. Writing, math are similar, but the science section is that's interesting. Where are we? The science section is separate. So you have a lot of questions about experimental design, interpreting charts and graphs that are all focused on one place, whereas on the SAT, they're distributed across the reading and writing. Yeah. Okay, let's take a quick look through the timeline of the ACT as well. This is a bit shorter. So in 59, it was invented, so about 6 years later than the SAT. They went for about, what is that, 20, 30 years there before they recentered. So that's a pretty big adjustment of 2 points. But since then, it's pretty much remained stable, which is, yeah, very different from the SAT. They did introduce an essay in 2005. But other than that, we can go on to the next slide. They made some slight adjustments to it and officially introduced superscoring in 21. So superscoring is a little bit different than score choice on the SAT. As much as the trend on the tests themselves has been toward making them simpler and simpler, it does seem like they're making more and more options for what to do afterward. So superscoring means that if you take the ACT several times in a row, you can choose the highest score for each section and combine those for your final score. It makes a huge difference in terms of when to retake and when not to retake the test. You can make it very much changes the nature of when you should retake and when you shouldn't. So that was a huge difference there. Okay, is this one still readable? Yes, it is. Okay. So here's just an overview of the number of students that took the ACT since it was introduced, just to show that it spiked up pretty quickly. So within 20 years of starting it, it was over 1 million. It was at 1.78 in 2020, compared to 2.2 million for the SAT. So they're roughly similar. But if you look at the overall trajectory there at the bottom, what you see is that's the percentage of students on the left across the nation that are taking the ACT. So it starts at about 50. Peaks, it looks like that's cutting off on this display, but it peaks right before COVID at 64% and then starts to drop, and then it really starts to drop. That last number was in 2020. So that's down to 35%. If you compare that to Maryland, we started much lower in the first place, so at 20%, and that last number, if you can't make it out, is 8%, as I mentioned. So those students who are choosing to take the ACT in Maryland are typically, if we can go to the next slide. Can we go forward one? Yeah. So we're going down from 30 to 8% in Maryland. But if you look at the really high scores here, so these are students that scored above a 32. across the nation. Of course, they stay more or less stable, but since 2017, in the middle of that right chart, there's a huge spike in the number of students who are getting really high scores on the ACT in Maryland. So all that to say, the evidence seems to show that students who are choosing to take the ACT are taking it mostly because they're really good test takers already, and it just kind of supports their application. And we do find that the scores for students that are already scoring very, very high, they tend to go hand in hand. So great. So if we can go back one more slide now, just wanted to note that over the last week or so, there have been a bunch of headlines about this. I'm sure that a lot of you have seen it. So the ACT.org, or the organization, actually released this press release. This is their own press release saying that the scores have dropped to the lowest in 30 years, and they attribute it to a pandemic slide. It's caused a lot of sort of reactions that don't seem to be based on the data. Without going too much more into it than we just did, what really seems to be happening is that a lot of the states that were keeping those scores at the higher end have actually ended their contracts with ACT, switched over to the SAT, and so it's not so much a decline in the mean as it is a statistical thing, and it's something that they really should have been aware of. So it's a bit confusing why they're choosing to describe it this way. It kind of plays into, I mean, there are some serious concerns about learning loss over COVID, but there is not a lot of evidence to support the idea that it's caused something like a huge drop in our national test scores. So that's nice. Yes. Okay. So that was the background about the two tests. And so now we're just going to go ahead with some comparisons between the two. Hopefully this makes it a lot clearer. So in terms of total time, 255 versus 3 hours, more or less the same. But because of the length of the passages on the ACT and because of the number of questions, you do end up having, as I mentioned, much more time per question on the SAT. So 43, so about double and about a third across these different sections. So that is the per question timing. Next slide would be, now, let me just see if I can salvage this one. I'm gonna have to save this for the end here in terms of the comparisons between them here. We're gonna have to skip to the next one, please. Thanks. Okay. You know what, sorry, if you can go back one, I can do this for sure. All right, so let me tell you about the differences in content. There aren't that many, but between the ACT and the SAT, here are the big differences in the reading. So the SAT is that top column there. The questions tend to be more nuanced, which means they ask a lot more about, like, what is the author's intent? What do you infer? You know, if their purpose is to do this, which choice is the best? So in terms of critical reading, it really requires these students to put themselves in the mind of the author, really think about why they're choosing to structure these passages in the way that they do. And for some students, that can be really difficult. I mean, especially a more literal minded, or like sort of a more, what do you call it? A more STEM sort of oriented way of thinking that can be a little bit difficult. So in contrast, the ACT's questions tend to be a bit more straightforward, a bit more linear, and sort of in the order that they show up in the text. So that is a big difference. And for some students, it is definitely the case that the ACT way of approaching the reading section can make a lot more sense for them. On the SAT, you get a lot of questions about vocabulary in context, you get a lot of questions about how to use evidence to support your conclusion. So you have these paired questions, which almost everybody finds to be the most difficult. So you'll have a question like, why did the author choose to do this? And you'll have to make your choice. And then the following question will say, which lines best support your answer? So you have to weigh the option of getting both of them wrong. And that is the last sort of very test specific skill that doesn't seem to be going anywhere anytime soon. But it focuses on logical arguments and on sort of scientific reasoning, because there isn't a dedicated science section on the SAT, pardon me. In terms of the grammar, you have on the SAT a lot of usage questions, a lot of sort of what is the proper tone. So should you use an informal or formal language, that sort of thing. If you're a big reader, these tend to be fairly easy on both tests. But the questions on the ACT grammar are a bit more wordy, a bit more confusing. I think overall, most students find the SAT grammar to be much, much simpler. So, good. So let's see. Finally, on the math, I mean, the big difference here is actually pretty straightforward. You've got on the SAT a lot of algebra. You've got fewer total concepts, but really going in on algebra, whereas the ACT is focusing primarily on geometry. So that's the big difference between those two on that section. Okay. Oh, I started screen sharing. Can you go to the next slide, please? There we are. All right, so back one. All right, so here are just a few things about both tests that are helpful, and some links to the best places to get more information about them. So you've got plenty of test dates all throughout the year for both the ACT and SAT. You could take it multiple times. The registration process is straightforward. The score releases are now getting back to students within 7 to 10 days, which is great. You've got late registrations all the way up until a week or two before the test itself, so that's great and much improved in the past few years. They are always updating those schedules. You can check them at collegeboard.com. For the ACT, that's act.org. A lot of parents have questions about accommodations. So for students that have ADHD, executive functioning, learning disabilities, you have all kinds of accommodations, such as you can have time and a half, 200% time, extra breaks. You can do testing in small groups in separate rooms. All of these, anything that has to do with an ADHD or executive functioning diagnosis, has to be done by specific professionals, obviously, and you can get the details about who's qualified to make that recommendation, the process, how far in advance you have to do anything that's going to be recognized by the College Board or ACT. You got to make sure to start that as early as possible. The obvious goal there is just to make sure that people aren't last minute trying to get extra time for students that don't have a genuine need for it. So that rtinetwork.org is fantastic. They have everything to do with the process for any kind of accommodations you need. So besides accommodations, the other most commonly asked question I think we get has to do with, like, how many times should we take the test? When should they take it first? And if they do it 2 or 3 times, is it for some reason, a lot of students and or parents think that admissions counselors are much more against 3 or 4 attempts at the test than they actually are. So when you factor in things like super scoring, and score choice, and the fact that most students tend to improve between the first and second test, you've got options to take it as many times as you need to. And yeah, again, it's a bit of an individual decision in terms of whether the biggest decision you've got to make is weighing burnout versus the potential to actually increase their specific skills. So, but again, theoretically, you can take it as many times as you want for both. And let's see. Oh yeah, finally, a list of up-to-date schools and their policies on SuperScore and score choice. That is fantastically useful and is a good thing to know before you make before you really start to put your plan together. A lot of times that gets left to the end, which is a bit of a mistake, because depending on your target schools, you can really have a completely different approach to SAT, ACT, and timing. So definitely recommend putting a few of those schools on a list up front as much as possible to tailor your approach toward that goal. How are we doing on time? 6:38, great. Okay, so the first thing that we do in order to help students decide between the two tests is this 60-second ACT versus SAT assessment that we've developed based on, I think we've had over 2,000 students take it now. And it really does do a pretty darn good job for a 1 minute long test. It's 11 questions. Oh no, it's cutting off there. Here, I'll put it in the chat. You can go straight to there we go. breakthroughtestprep.com/better-test, and you can submit your score or the results right there along with your email address, and we'll get back to you with which test your teen favors and why. And so after taking that, we've got some skill set assessments that are basically the kinds of things that help students succeed on either the ACT or SAT. And in terms of motivation or learning styles, can play a huge role as well. And the final thing to sort of take into consideration is what are your actual goals, both on the terms of students' motivation, parents' motivation. Are we trying to increase a score to hit the acceptance cutoff or a particular school? Are we feeling that the PSAT score that we got doesn't really reflect our overall academic ability? So there are a lot of sort of very specific test prep skills, but also they always interact with the sort of emotion or the motivation of each student. So these are all available on breakthroughtestprep.com, and always happy to give some free strategy sessions for anybody who is trying to decide. Can we go on to the next slide? Yeah. Great. Okay, so I think we're perfect. We'll have some time for Q&A. So here, though, are the main things to do for those of you who have 8th, 9th graders at the moment. You can sort of get started as early as you like, because the main thing to do in terms of improving your efficient reading is to read more. To make it really a habit, 10 to 15 minutes before bed of actual high quality, well-written, even editorials, opinion columns, it doesn't matter what it is, so much as we're using the kind of vocabulary that's going to show up on the test, the kind of sentence structures, or things like implications, inferences that they'll be asked about when it comes to test day. So really trying to build that habit in early is the biggest predictor of success on the verbal sections of both tests. Keeping in mind that you won't be asked anything above Algebra 2 on either test is also very helpful. So if you've got a really advanced math student, sometimes they'll be 2 or 3 years above the level that they actually need. So then we have to go back and review. So just keeping that in mind early is always better. We do offer an efficient reading course, which is a very good start for freshmen and sophomores. It's not full on ACT prep or SAT prep specifically, but we focus on improving your reading speed overall and how to vary that reading speed according to the type of content that you're reading. It is a really handy, we hear all the time from juniors or seniors that like they wish they had started it earlier, because focusing on how you're reading a text and why, and being able to really consciously change the way that you interact with the different kinds of writing is the most predictive skill that you can focus on in verbal preps.